When most people think about the Second World War, they picture tanks grinding forward, bombers darkening the sky, and armies clashing across continents. That focus is understandable, but it misses the deeper truth of how entire nations survived years of total war. Long before victory parades and surrender documents, survival depended on systems that did not collapse. Food still had to be grown, families still had to function, cities still had to endure bombardment, and morale still had to hold. In almost every combatant nation, women became the backbone of those systems. Not symbolically, not occasionally, but daily, relentlessly, and often invisibly. If you want to understand how societies actually endure collapse-level stress, you have to study what women did on the home front during WWII, because they were the ones preventing total breakdown. This story begins not with heroism as propaganda, but with necessity under pressure. By 1940, tens of millions of men were gone from farms, factories and households. Governments could issue speeches and posters, but they could not replace labour, skill or emotional stability with slogans. Women filled those gaps not because they were inspired, but because there was no alternative. Nations that failed to mobilise women efficiently paid for it in shortages, unrest and military weakness. Those that succeeded gained an enormous strategic advantage. How women kept food systems alive when agriculture was stripped of men is one of the clearest examples. Across Britain, the Soviet Union, Germany and occupied Europe, women became the primary agricultural workforce. They planted, harvested, managed livestock, repaired tools, and adapted to chronic shortages of fertilizer, fuel, and machinery. British women in the Women's Land Army were not performing symbolic labour. They were producing calories that kept cities alive during the U-boat blockade. In the Soviet Union, women ran collective farms while facing requisitions, weather extremes, and the constant fear of losing sons and husbands at the front. What matters here is not sentiment, but systems thinking. These women learned how to stretch yields, rotate crops, substitute inputs, and preserve food efficiently. For modern survivalists, the lesson is clear. Resilience depends on decentralized food knowledge and the ability of households, not just states, to adapt production under stress. How women stabilized industrial output while entire economies were retooled for war is equally critical. Factories did not simply hire women and carry on as before. Production methods had to change, training had to be accelerated, and quality had to be maintained under pressure. Women became machinists, welders, inspectors, and assembly workers producing aircraft, ammunition, vehicles, and communications equipment. In the United States, the famous imagery of Rosie the Riveter obscures the deeper reality that women mastered precision work previously considered too complex or physically demanding. In Britain and Germany alike, women maintained output despite long hours, bombing raids and material shortages. This teaches a hard historical truth. Societies that underestimate who can perform critical labour under crisis are weaker than those that adapt quickly. Practical application today means cross-training skills within households and communities, rather than assuming rigid roles will survive disruption. How women held families and communities together under sustained trauma is a role rarely quantified, yet absolutely decisive. Wartime governments feared civilian collapse as much as military defeat. Women managed rationing systems, ensured fair distribution, cared for children and the elderly, and absorbed the psychological shock of loss while maintaining routine. In bombed cities like London, Hamburg, Leningrad and Tokyo, women organized shelters, enforced blackout discipline, and rebuilt daily life after destruction. These were not passive acts. They required decision-making, leadership and emotional control under conditions most people today would find, well, quite unbearable. For historians and preparedness-minded viewers, the lesson is that morale is not abstract. It is maintained through routines, mutual aid, and competent household leadership, often carried by those closest to daily life. How women operated within resistance, intelligence, and logistical networks further shows their strategic importance. In occupied Europe, women served as couriers, safe house operators, document forgers, and intelligence gatherers precisely because they attracted less suspicion. This was not accidental. Resistance movements learned to exploit social assumptions to survive. Women moved information, food, and weapons through checkpoints and hostile territory, often at extreme personal risk. Their contribution reminds us that asymmetric survival depends on adaptability, social camouflage, and trust networks rather than brute force. The modern application, really, lies in understanding how information and logistics move quietly through communities long before open conflict or collapse becomes visible. How wartime experience permanently altered women's competence and expectations is the final piece of the picture. After years of running farms, factories, finances and families alone, many women did not return easily to pre-war roles. Even where governments attempted to push them back, the knowledge remained. Skills learned under pressure do not disappear. This matters because World War II shows that once a population segment is forced to carry systemic responsibility, the society itself changes. For anyone studying long-term resilience, this demonstrates how crises redistribute capability and why post-crisis systems rarely return to their original form. The silent role of women during World War II was not silent because it was small, but because history often records noise rather than structure. Without women maintaining food supply, industrial output, social stability and adaptive networks, no amount of military strength would have been enough. If you care about how nations survive extreme stress or how societies might endure future shocks, this is not a side story. It is the story. If you found this valuable and want more deep, serious analysis on how past societies survived collapse-level events, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts, share this with fellow historians and preparedness thinkers, and keep this conversation alive where it belongs.